The meeting of the Ocean Subcommittee hearing on Arctic matters to order, and we thank everyone for attending and being here. We appreciate it. To our guests, we appreciate that they're also here. We have two government witnesses joining us by teleconference, video conference actually, and we thank them. This is part of what you see with budget reductions. They can't be here, but we've tuned them in here, which we think is just as good. Alaskans are used to video conferencing, so we thank them for being here. I'll introduce them in a second. As chair of the Oceans Senate Subcommittee, this is the fifth hearing on the challenges and opportunities facing Alaska with coming Arctic development. We've had hearings in Washington, Barrow, Anchorage, as well as several trips to communities in between to engage Alaskans, investors, developers, policymakers, and regulators in this discussion. Some questions: the future of the Arctic development. I'd like to say it's here, whether people like it or not. Arctic development, oil and gas exploration, shipping, tourism is happening in our Arctic waters now. The question is whether the U.S. will set the bar for doing it right. By using strong science and data, by incorporating local traditional knowledge, with critical supporting infrastructure and under effective regulation to protect our Arctic people and communities and subsistence resources upon which they live on. Since coming to the U.S. Senate, I put together a package of legislation to help get us there, to improve our scientific understanding of the Arctic, to research Arctic health needs, develop the ports and other infrastructure we need, share the Arctic generated revenues with its communities and tribes, and strengthen our international profile in Arctic affairs. I'm also working closely with the administration to make the right investments now to ensure safe and responsible development, such as adequate ice-breaking capacity. Today, our goal is to look specifically at current and anticipated future marine activity in the Arctic. Let's be clear, this hearing is about the broad context of increased maritime activity, not just about oil and gas development or the Kulik grounding this winter. Kulik was a high-profile example of challenges posed to marine transportation in the Arctic. In 2012, there were more than 250 vessels operating the Arctic Ocean, over 480 transit through the Bering Strait. This, of course, is due to declining Arctic sea ice, which allows increased access for longer periods. It creates increased economic incentives for shipping to move through the Bering Strait and Arctic Ocean. I've also said we face greater risk from the increasing traffic we're seeing along the Russian Northern Sea Route and later through the Canadian Northwest Passage than we do from oil and gas drilling in the Arctic. In the challenging Arctic maritime environment, where there are no harbors or refuge and few aids to navigation or search and rescue assets, mariners also have less accurate weather forecasts and charts where there are dozens of miles between accurate depths and readings. And unlike oil and gas interests, which have incentives to work closely with Arctic communities, shipping interests are more transient and have fewer resources to mitigate risk and respond to problems. What I'd like to now hear, we have two panels set up today from our experts. We do expect in the short term, medium, and long term what we need and what we need to prepare for is what our panels, I hope, will address. I plan to take what I hear here today back to Washington to move ahead on our Arctic legislation. This is timely because we're now considering the Coast Guard authorizing bill. It seems like we just finished one, but we'll be back into it. Energy legislation, infrastructure investment, bills for the Army Corps, transportation, environmental protection agencies. A variety of issues are going to be in front of us for the next several months. So we look forward to the testimony today. Our first panel is made up of three individuals. Tommy Boudreau from the Department of Interior, who's joining us by VTC. One moment, Tommy, I'll have you speak. Rear Admiral Tom Ostabo, Commander of the Coast Guard District 17, which of course we were just joking a little bit there. We have this routine, we're always back together again. And Pete Slavey here, Vice President of Exploration of Shell. Again, this is our first panel. We'll have a second panel after this, and we thank all three of you for willing to attend and be part of this testimony. And again, our goal is to focus on not only from what we did this last year, but where we see the next stages of future Arctic development. Let me first turn to Assistant Secretary Tommy Boudreau. Tommy?
Thank you, Chairman Begich. I appreciate very much the opportunity to appear before the Subcommittee on the Oceans, Atmosphere, Fisheries, and Coast Guard to discuss the extremely important and timely topic, assessing U.S. preparedness and response in the Arctic, the opportunities and challenges of increased marine activity. I apologize for being unable to appear for the field hearing in person in Anchorage, my hometown, and I'm grateful for the work of the committee staff to facilitate this video connection, and I trust that it's working.
Absolutely. It's only 75 degrees here, and it's sunny, and there is no snow, but I'm glad that
Spring's a little delayed in BC, too. It's my sincere pleasure to appear on this panel, particularly with United States Coast Guard Rear Admiral Ostabo, for whom I have tremendous respect. No one understands more deeply the unique maritime challenges of working safely offshore Alaska than Admiral Ostabo and the men and women of the Coast Guard 17th District. The Interior Department works closely with the Coast Guard on a range of strategic and oversight issues relating to Alaska and the U.S. Arctic, including offshore oil and gas exploration. The Coast Guard performed extremely well in planning for and playing a central role in overseeing Shell's 2012 Alaska offshore oil and gas exploration program. In particular, I admired the courage and professionalism of the Coast Guard emergency response personnel who safely rescued all crew members of the Culloch drilling rig after the rig lost its tow during a severe storm in the Gulf of Alaska at the end of last December. I would like to start by emphasizing the strategic and economic importance of the Alaskan Arctic to the United States. The U.S. Arctic Outer Continental Shelf holds tremendous energy resource potential. For example, my agency, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, estimates that the Chukchi Sea contains more than 15 billion barrels of undiscovered recoverable oil, which is second only to the Central Gulf of Mexico in terms of its offshore conventional energy potential. The United States is a leader among Arctic nations in evaluating the economic and energy potential of safe and environmentally responsible offshore oil and gas development in the Arctic, as well as the multitude of challenges facing the region, including the consequences of rapid climate change. It is essential that the United States understand the resource potential of the Arctic, and offshore oil and gas exploration has a key role in developing that understanding. However, exploration must be conducted cautiously, safely, and responsibly in light of the sensitive Arctic environment and the Alaska natives who are closely connected to the Arctic Ocean for subsistence and fundamental aspects of their culture and traditions. DOI's recent review of Shell's 2012 Beaufort Sea and Chukchi Sea program, which I led, identified a number of principles for safe and responsible offshore oil and gas exploration in the Arctic for the future. First, all phases of an offshore Arctic program, including preparations, drilling, maritime and emergency response operations, must be integrated and subject to strong operator management and government oversight. Second, Arctic offshore operations must be well planned, fully ready, and have clear objectives in advance of the drilling season. These first two principles are fundamental to working safely offshore Alaska. Arctic offshore operations are extremely complex, and there are substantial environmental challenges and operational risks throughout every phase of the endeavor. Moreover, because of the inherent geographic, logistical, and environmental challenges associated with working on the Arctic OCS, the operating plan and objectives of any offshore Arctic program must be well planned and designed to provide operational clarity, while also allowing for ample flexibility in light of variable and changing conditions and the need for safe demobilization. Third, operators must maintain strong, direct management and oversight of their contractors. Fourth, operators must understand and plan for the variability and challenges of Alaskan conditions. Reliable weather and ice forecasting play a significant role in ensuring safe operations offshore Alaska, including but not limited to the Arctic. Robust forecasting and tracking technology, information sharing among industry and government, and local knowledge and experience are essential to managing the substantial challenges and risks that Alaskan conditions pose for all offshore operations. Finally, respect for and coordination with local communities are paramount. It is imperative that offshore exploration in the Arctic be harmonized with the needs of North Slope communities, including traditional subsistence use. Our report also identified important principles for government oversight of offshore drilling activity in the Arctic that must be carried forward and further developed. The federal government, including DOI, Coast Guard, NOAA, EPA, and others, engaged in strong and an unprecedented level of interagency coordination, information sharing, and cooperation related to the regulatory approval process and oversight of Shell's 2012 program. Senator Begich, I know this is an area that has been important to you and that you have championed. This is an area of success from the 2012 experience that should be carried forward and improved upon further in the future. Finally, government and industry should continue to evaluate appropriate Arctic-specific standards relating to offshore operations. For example, operators working in the Arctic should be encouraged to enter into resource sharing and mutual aid agreements to provide each other with access to operational and emergency response resources. This is an issue Admiral Ostabo and I have discussed at some length. A cooperative model offers potential logistical and commercial efficiency, as well as safety and environmental advantages through the reduction of cumulative operational risks and footprints, including air emissions. Thank you, and I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Let me now move to Admiral Ostabo. Thank you very much for your continued interest in the Arctic and your robust work, especially in this last season. So please let me have you go and testify.
Senator Begich, distinguished colleagues, Tommy, it's good to see you again. As always, I enjoy speaking on the great work that your Coast Guard is doing here in Alaska. I am pleased to discuss the Coast Guard's Arctic responsibilities and operations. This past summer, we prepared for Arctic operations driven by increased offshore maritime activity and industries' planned drilling operations in the Chukchi and the Beaufort Sea. Collaborating closely with federal, local, state, tribal government partners, we worked with industry to regulate all parties operating offshore. The lessons we learned from this past year will inform our planning and strategy to ensure that we remain always ready to ensure safety, security, and stewardship in the emerging maritime frontier of the Arctic. Coast Guard operations in the Arctic last year consisted of Arctic Shield 2012, which will be an ongoing Coast Guard operation in perpetuity for the Arctic. The Coast Guard has been operating in the Arctic since 1867, when Alaska was just a territory. Then as now, our mission is to assist scientific exploration, chart the waters, and provide humanitarian assistance to the native tribes, conduct search and rescue, and enforce U.S. laws and regulations throughout the region. In Alaska, the Coast Guard's aircraft and vessels monitor more than 950,000 square miles of water off the Alaskan coast to enforce U.S. laws. We patrol an even larger area of the North Pacific, as you know, sir, to stop large-scale high seas drift net fishing and other illegal fishing practices, including foreign incursions to U.S. EEZ. We also conduct marine safety and environmental protection missions throughout the region. The Coast Guard continues to push forward to assess our capabilities to conduct operations in the Arctic. Since 2008, we have set up temporary forward operating locations on the North Slope, in Prudhoe Bay, Nome, Barrow, Kotzebue, to test our capabilities with cutters, boats, helicopters, communications equipment, and maritime safety and security teams. We also deployed our light ice-breaking capable ships, our 225-foot ocean-going buoy tenders, to test our equipment, train our crews, and increase our awareness of the activity going on offshore. Additionally, each year from April to November, we have flown 2 sorties a month to assess maritime activities in the region and to ensure maritime domain awareness. To protect the Arctic environment, we are reaching out to industry, private sector, to address their significant responsibilities for pollution prevention, preparedness, and response. Those engaged in offshore commercial activity in the Arctic must also plan and prepare for emergency response in the face of a harsh environment, long transient distances for air and surface assets, and limited response resources. We continue to work to improve awareness, contingency planning, and communications. We're also actively participating with the Department of Interior-led Interagency Working Group on coordination of domestic energy development and permitting in Alaska, established by Executive Order 13580. to synchronize the efforts of the federal agencies responsible for overseeing safe and responsible development of Alaskans' offshore energy opportunities. While prevention is critical, the Coast Guard must also be able to manage the response to pollution incidences where responsible parties are not known or fail to adequately respond. Last year, we exercised our Vessel of Opportunity skimming system, VOS, and our spilled oil recovery system, SOARS, in the Alaskan waters as part of Arctic Shield 12 in the vicinity of Barrow. Fisheries are also a concern in the region. The National Maritime Fisheries Service, based upon a recommendation from the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, with which the Coast Guard participates in, has imposed a moratorium on fishing within the U.S. exclusive economic zone north of the Bering Strait until an assessment of the practicality of sustained commercial fishing is completed. The Coast Guard will continue to carry out its mission to enforce the protect living marine resources in the high latitudes. We are employing our waterways analysis and management system to assess vessel traffic, which is continuing to grow, and the density to determine the need for improved aids to navigation and other safety requirements. We are also moving forward with the Bering Strait Port Access Route Study in coordination with our international partners, which is a primarily analysis to evaluate vessel traffic management and appropriate ship routing measures in the Bering Strait. The Coast Guard continues to support international multilateral organizations, studies, projects, and initiatives. We are actively working with the Arctic Council, International Maritime Organization, and other respected working groups. We are leading the U.S. delegation of the Arctic Council Oil Spill Task Force, which is developing international instruments on Arctic maritime oil pollution preparedness and response, and are conducting joint contingency response exercises with Canada. Last month, we hosted representatives from Russia, their State Maritime Pollution Control, Salvage, and Rescue Administration, to sign an expanded memorandum of understanding and joint contingency planning to foster cooperation between our two nations in the event of an oil spill in the region. We will continue to engage Arctic nations, international organizations, industry, academia, Alaska state, local, and tribal governments to strengthen our partnerships and interagencies. Our engagement with the Alaska Native tribes continues to be highly beneficial. We are working hard to ensure tribal equities are recognized and that the indigenous people and their way of life are protected. We look forward to continuing to strengthen our partnership with Alaska Natives. Looking ahead, over the next 10 to 15 years, the Coast Guard's regional mission profile will continue to evolve. Increased human activity will increase the significance and the volume of maritime issues throughout the region, issues such as freedom of navigation, offshore resource exploration, and environmental preservation. The Coast Guard's strategic approach will pursue the capabilities in the future to perform our statutory missions as necessary in the Arctic to ensure safe, secure, and environmentally sustainable operations take place. This strategy will consist with our services approach to performing maritime safety and security and stewardship functions across all of our 11 statutory missions. Finally, the Motu, Kullik, and Noble Discovery. I need to mention the two of them. The Coast Guard certainly shares concerns regarding the recent grounding of Motu Kullik, an event which highlights the rigors of operating in Alaskan waters. In January, I directed a marine casualty safety investigation into the facts and circumstances surrounding the grounding of the Kullik. Members of the Coast Guard's Investigation National Center of Expertise are leading the investigation and coordinating with local Coast Guard commands to utilize the technical expertise necessary to find out what happened. National Transportation Safety Board, Bureau of Safety, Environmental Enforcement are also involved to examine all aspects of the vessel casualty. Additionally, I also referred the casualty investigation of the drill ship Noble Discoverer, also operating in Alaska waters, to the Department of Justice for their review and potential follow-on action. Last week, I also referred a separate Kullik investigation into potential MARPOL violations from 2012 to the Department of Justice for their review and potential follow-on action. As the Coast Guard and the Department of Justice are still actively engaged in these investigations, it would not be appropriate for me to provide additional information at this time. However, as soon as the investigation is complete and the final reports are issued, Senator, I will ensure that you get a copy of them and your staff does as well. In conclusion, Senator Begich and distinguished colleagues, the Coast Guard in Alaska will continue building its strategy using a whole-of-government approach that will inform national dialogue and policy and development of the Arctic region. While there are many challenges, the increasingly open Arctic Ocean also presents unique opportunities for our nation and specifically for the people of Alaska. We look forward to working with the Congress on how the Coast Guard can continue to support our national Arctic objectives, protect its fragile environment, and remain semper paratus, always ready in the new ocean and for the people of Alaska. Thank you, sir, for this opportunity to testify here today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Admiral. And let me move now to Pete Slavey, who's Vice President of Exploration.
Thank you very much, Senator Begich, Mr. Chair. I am Pete Slavey, Vice President for Shell Alaska. I appreciate the opportunity today regarding this opportunity to testify about our activities in the Arctic. My presence here is no doubt related to Shell's exploration program offshore Alaska in 2012, and that program does involve marine activity. Today, I'll describe Shell's 2012 drilling. Today I'll describe Shell's 2012 drilling operations in the Chukchi and the Beaufort seas, which will focus on this maritime activity and the activities that supported those operations. Then I'm going to very briefly highlight some of the government and industry initiatives that contribute to the dialogue about maritime activities in the Arctic. I have put recommendations for policymakers in my written testimony, but because of time, won't be able to testify or speak to that today. In 2012, Shell drilled a portion of 2 wells, one in the Beaufort and one in the Chukchi, what we call top holes. Although the wells didn't reach hydrocarbon objectives because of the time constraints, they did mark an historic re-entry into the U.S. Arctic offshore. These were the first wells drilled in open water offshore Alaska in more than 15 years, and the first step to validating the enormous offshore resource potential. Shell's drilling program, supported by our logistics teams, oil spill response assets, and with serious attention to stakeholder expectations, was carried out safely and successfully. Let me say that again. Our drilling operations were completed safely and successfully. After the drilling ceased, we demobilized our vessels, including the Discover, the Noble Discover, and the Kulik drilling rigs, south of the U.S. Arctic Theater. It was while leaving the theater of operations that issues with the Discover were identified by the Coast Guard and the Kulik ran aground. These incidents are the subject of ongoing governmental investigations, and I will not talk about them today. I would like to acknowledge publicly the efforts of over 700 men and women who worked 24/7 on behalf of Shell and the Incident Command to ensure that that incident, the Kulik grounding, didn't escalate. Shell's onshore and offshore response teams put forward a Herculean effort in a very short amount of time. That included immediate escalation and notifications of the appropriate government agencies, deployment of Shell air and marine assets, 19 tugs, and approximately 20 aircraft, forward mobilized personnel to the impacted communities, and a suite of oil spill response equipment into the region. As you are aware, Mr. Chairman, no people were harmed and there was minimal impact to the environment as a result of the Kulik grounding. Finally, the assets I referred to played a key role in the recovery of the Kulik. In many ways, mirror the marine and air assets that we have available during our drilling operations in the Arctic in 2012. Of course, this story wouldn't be complete without me acknowledging a couple people in the room, and Admiral Ostabo and the work that the Coast Guard played in that was absolutely key, as well as Captain Mailer and the amount of time that we spent together over New Year's in the Marriott was significant. I feel a whole lot about both the gentlemen as well. We were also very, very happy to have spent and had a successful relationship with the people of Kodiak. And one of the things I will share with you, Mr. Chair, is that during the time we did bring people in from Old Harbor in the areas, and they frankly said, you know, you've got a really very, very difficult situation here. You've got the cullic on the beach, and we appreciate the fact that you stood up 700 people, but we don't think that you'll ever be able to get that rig off the beach. And of course, in my position, you can't predict what will happen, but I did promise that we would do everything we could to move the rig off the beach. And so I'm equally pleased that we were able to do what we did and promise what we did through the work of the Coast Guard, Shell, State of Alaska, the communities, Smith Salvage. I'm very, very pleased that we were able to do what was arguably one of the most difficult marine salvage operations attempted on the Alaskan coast. Now let me focus on some of the efforts on Shell's 2012 exploration program that relate to marine operations and highlight some of the steps we took to ensure that these operations were completed safely and successfully. Going into the Alaskan Arctic, we understood that there was limited infrastructure. We assembled and brought the majority of the assets that we required both onshore and offshore with us. And we did so with a commitment to setting the bar higher for an environmentally responsible program in the Arctic. We pursued the goal of having the smallest possible footprint and no significant influence or impact on the North Slope communities and the traditional hunting activities. At every step, we worked with federal agencies, the state of Alaska, local governments, and most importantly, stakeholders on the North Slope to develop a program that aspired to the highest technical, operational, and environmental standards. Let me give you a few facts and figures on marine and aviation logistics as far as accomplishments. They included approximately 250,000 miles traveled in 2012 by 23 vessels, 500 vessel-to-vessel transfers, 3,250,000 gallons of ultra-low sulfur diesel transferred, 10 vessels built and 6 modified in shipyards across the U.S., 250,000 tons of cargo transferred at sea, 20,000 protected species observations, walrus, seals, whales, etc., that continue to develop a very important database. 11,877 personnel transfers, jobs for Alaskans, 562 rotary wing and 535 fixed wing flights. In short, we secured the tools and technologies needed to keep people safe and conserve the environment. As you are aware, maritime activities in the Arctic will increase, and routes will open and oil and gas activities expand across the Arctic. Oil and gas development is underway, as you alluded, in the U.S. as well as offshore Russia, Canada, Norway, and Greenland. Governments are considering appropriate policy and responses through various international organizations such as the Arctic Council. Industry is contributing to the dialogue through a range of assessments and assignments and joint venture industry programs that increase knowledge about the Arctic. Such government and private sector initiatives must continue. I hope these remarks are useful and informative, and thank the Senator for the opportunity today.
Thank you very much, Pete, and thank you for the recommendations in your written testimony. I'll ask you some questions on that in just a second. What I'd like to do is ask Tommy Boudreau first a series of questions. I know at quarter till we have to sign you off to hook up another VTC, so I'll try to go through my questions fairly rapidly here if you can bear with me. First is, as we're working through the sequestration, the budget cuts that were automatically implemented throughout all the different agencies, do you see those reductions and sequestration having an impact of doing permits in a timely manner for 2014?
So sequestration, as you know, Senator, presents enormous challenges across the federal government. And that's certainly true of the agencies for which I'm responsible, in particular BOEM and BSEE. BOEM and BSEE are nothing if not can-do agencies. I expect that we will do our utmost, as we always have, to complete our work in a very thorough way, demand compliance with our high standards, but complete our work promptly as well. This will require a lot of resource management, and frankly, I am concerned about the potential impact of sequester. Remember, the history of MMS and the reason BOEM and BESI are in existence in the first place. MMS was a severely under-resourced agency. We have worked with Congress in connection with our reform efforts to remedy that in large part, and I am concerned that sequester presents a step backwards from that. But we will continue to do everything we can to fulfill our responsibilities, do so thoroughly, and do so promptly.
Let me, if I can follow up on that, I know you now have new requirements to do the, you took over what EPA used to do on air permits for drilling. Is that also now, I guess first question is, have you been able to gear up under these conditions of sequestration, and are you seeing also a potential of a slowdown in that process? As you know, that's a new piece of your equation now, taken from EPA. Can you give me a little comment on that, or is that similar to what you just described of sequestration overall?
Well, it's similar, but we are very far along in establishing our air quality program with respect to the Arctic OCS. That requires, and we have conducted very close work with EPA. EPA was quite far along, actually, in reviewing air permit submissions from, for example, ConocoPhillips. And so we've been able to piggyback from that work moving forward, which I think has been great assistance to the program. As you know, Senator, there are significant differences between air quality program administered under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act and EPA's authorities. And so we're carrying forward the quality of the air quality analysis through a combination of application of our regs as well as NEPA, but also implementing what I hope it will be a very efficient and clear process. So there are budget challenges associated with all of this, but we're trying to address those challenges bureau-wide, not merely in the region.
Will you be able to, and I'm going to move to another subject here in a second, but just to finish up on the budgetary issues, will you be able to, at some point, from your department or from the broader perspective of the Interior Department, be able to report to us, here's where you think there might be slowdowns or impacts, enough where we can get a longer-term picture? Because as you know better than probably most in your department, because you're from Alaska, that the timetable of how you do this permitting is critical, because you could literally be off a few months but really change a year or year and a half of development because of the timetable of development that occurs here in Alaska versus the Gulf of Mexico, as an example. Will you be able to report to us at some point?
Yeah, I'm absolutely willing to continue communicating on a real-time basis with this issue. Permitting in Alaska presents the challenge you described. You have to have a very efficient and timely process given the limited drilling window. From a regulatory perspective, it also offers certain advantages in that the volume is not as large as, say, the Gulf of Mexico, for example, and you are able to do some advanced planning, particularly now that, for example, Shell has paused its program, and so we're really looking at 2014 potentially for Shell as well as for ConocoPhillips. So that offers, in my mind, opportunity for advanced planning, including around internal resources.
Let me ask you two other quick questions, and then while you were talking, a thing flashed across you telling us we have just minutes left with you. You can't see that, we can only see it. So, but let me.
That wasn't my doing.
I know. You know, it's a new technology. I like it now. You guys probably love this. When you're at a testimony, you get this little sign that flashes up. I know it wasn't your doing. Let me ask you, because ConocoPhillips will be doing a different type of drilling, I think it's a jackup rig, and how the blowout preventers are situated. They're not down on the ocean floor, they're on the rig itself. Are you, and maybe you can't answer this yet, are you going to require ConocoPhillips to have a containment dome similar to what Shell has done, or are you just going to utilize the blowout preventers on the surface? Give me a sense there. Maybe you can't answer this yet because it's still in process, but can you give me a little sense there on that?
Yeah, generally, we're going to look for the same things from ConocoPhillips that we looked for with respect to Shell's operation, which is a performance standard around the ability to address any loss of well control at the source. That is extremely important, particularly in the Arctic environment, where opportunities for spill response in the event of a loss of well control are limited by the remoteness of the geography, encroachment of sea ice, and a host of other factors. And so we will be working very closely with ConocoPhillips on their ability to perform with respect to source control. We don't prescribe a one-size-fits-all solution to this issue, but we will be very demanding on this issue.
Let me, I'll end with this, and again, I want to thank you for your testimony. Thank you for participating. I know we'll have more questions for you. We'll present through the record, but one, I think this is a simple question, and that is the Interagency Working Group. I'm assuming that it is working well, and if you have recommendations, not necessarily right now, but if you have recommendations to improve that, I would be very interested in hearing that at some point, because I know it's something that I'm very obviously active around. I think it's been working, but maybe you could give a quick comment on that, and then we'll look for recommendations later.
Yeah, it is working quite well. The focus and the genesis of the working group was around permitting issues. That remains one of the core focuses of the working group, but we're taking it further under Deputy Secretary Hayes' leadership to improve the overall quality as well as efficiency of federal oversight in Alaska, including coordination with the public and stakeholder outreach. As you know, we, in executing our statutory responsibilities, place significant interest in public outreach and outreach with Native communities. There are real opportunities through the working group to ensure that that input is shared broadly through the federal government, as well as to minimize the burden on local communities from all of the federal agencies seeking their input. So there's real opportunities there that we'll be carrying forward.
Thank you very much, Tommy. Right across, you cannot see it, it says this meeting will end in 1 minute, so your timing was perfect. So let me just say thank you very much. Thank you for your testimony. I know, and I appreciate you doing this by VTC. We, of course, as you know, in Alaska, are not, this is not unusual for us to do this, so and I think it worked very well. So I thank you for your testimony. Thank you for participating. I think they will do something to you momentarily and then vanish from our screen, but I'm going to continue with the two other folks here. So thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Senator.
So we're still on screen, so be careful what you do. Let me ask Admiral Osimo, you had a couple things that I thought were interesting to me, and one is, you've mentioned this not only in the last testimony last year we had, but also here, the ongoing concern of, oil and gas development is important, but in the sense of shipping and the amount of movement of ships in the Arctic and the Bering Sea is increasing at a dramatic pace, more than I think most people in the country realize, and that creates unique challenges with you. And there was one note I made, and it was on the International Maritime Organization Polar Code, which is all about what's the standard that we'll all operate under in this region. Can you give me an update of kind of where that's at? And for folks that are here and also listening, this is just not about shipping, it's also the many vessels that Pete Slavey talked about that we utilize. They all have to transit through there, so it's a multifaceted use of that area. But tell me how that's coming about and what we see as long-term to make sure we have some standards, because a lot of those ships are foreign flag, and we have no clue their capacity, their condition. Hopefully we know what they have in them, but even that may be of concern. Give me your thoughts on where we are on that and where we think we might be going.
Yes, sir. Senator, that's a great question, and it hits a number of facets that we cover in one, hopefully not too long response. You mentioned there are almost 500 vessels went through the Bering Strait last year. 22 of them were Shells. The rest of them belong to somebody else. Who did they belong to? Where were they going? What were they carrying? What were their qualifications of the mariners on board? What was the material condition of the ships? Very greatly. If it was a ship that was leaving from a U.S. port going to another U.S. port, if it was a shipping or barge combination that was engaged in U.S. traffic and trade, we had a lot of oversight on that. But if it's, as you said, a foreign flag vessel with a foreign crew going from one foreign port on the north side of Russia, for example, to Singapore or China, there's very little that the U.S. can demand and very little that the Coast Guard can do to become informed about that or to demand certain standards of care on board those ships. To address that problem, what is being done through the IMO and this idea of let's have a polar code that addresses not only the standards of operation.
And IMO is the International Maritime Organization.
International Maritime Organization under the United Nations. So to take a look at what would be the appropriate material conditions and requirements on ships that operate in the Arctic, hull thickness, propulsion requirements, endurance requirements, firefighting requirements, those kinds of safety of life at sea, we call it SOLAS requirements. What would those look like in the Arctic? What would be the prudent set there? Also, what would be the prudent set of qualifications for the mariners that operate those? Would they have to be ice pilots? Would they have to have a certain amount of training to operate in the Arctic? Both of those things would have to go together. Obviously, having the greatest ship in the world with inappropriately trained folks, it doesn't really help you out. They both have to come together. That is moving forward. The Coast Guard is heavily involved in structuring that, but as you know, sir, as a major international agreement, it takes time to move that forward. And since the time that initiative began, things have changed in the Arctic. So things like the offshore mobile drilling rigs, they're not necessarily covered. Carbon footprint for ships is not necessarily covered. There is going to be an opportunity to go back and modify, I think, some of our requirements in the Polar Code, but currently it's primarily about safety of life at sea, firefighting and response capabilities on board the ship, and the mariner qualifications. And it is moving forward slowly through the IMO process.
And do you feel the other countries are participating in a way that's going to produce an end product?
Yes, sir. The other Arctic nations, I think, are working very closely and collaboratively together. One of the things that we see happening through the Arctic Council and through some observer status is a lot of other countries that you wouldn't normally think of involved in the Arctic are working hard to have their contribution put in there. For example, I recently met with the Singaporean ambassador, and he's very interested in influencing the Polar Code. So there's the more people that come to this, as you know, from a committee perspective, it's harder to do so.
Let me ask you on the same subject, and I know it's a concern, but tell me if, as the admiral for the 17th district, both are probably concerns of oil and gas development and shipping, but what's the bigger of the two over the long haul here? We're about to have someone else. Okay, let me hang on one second. Helen, you're on the next panel. We haven't gotten to you yet, so be patient. You can sit there patiently, or you can come back into the screen when we call on you, but just so you know, you're on the screen, so whatever you do, we'll be watching you. Your choice, so don't feel like you have to sit there and watch us go through this. We're closing out the second panel, or first panel here, so thank you very much for being here. So what is the biggest risk? One of the things I've said is the shipping is what I'm always worried about. I think the standards that are multiple standards on the oil and gas industry are from many different agencies, but on shipping, we're just, it makes me more nervous. And tell me, where do you see the risk in Arctic and Bering Sea, because they're connected in the way of transportation route?
Senator, first, in my job, I'm worried about everything.
Right, that's why.
Obviously.
I knew that.
So I never sleep. And certainly when it comes to environmental issues, it's hard to say whether a gallon of oil in the water is not a problem or is a problem. Anything going in the water that shouldn't be there's a concern to us, and clearly anything that produces a sheen on U.S. waters is something that we need to be involved in. That said, when I look at risk, and when I look at the resources that I have, you have to take that risk apart a little bit. And there's the consequence side of risk, how big a consequence is from something that happens, and the likelihood something happening. So when I look at likelihood, and I look at the numbers of ships that are coming through the Bering, I look at the numbers of incidences we've had in Alaskan waters, fires, collisions, groundings, people falling overboard. I looked, when Culloch incident happened, we had 15 other SAR cases going on in the state of Alaska at the same time.
At the same time.
At the same moment, same day.
Right.
When I look at the numbers of groundings that we have one which I brought some pictures of that's a very much big concern to me today with Pacific Producer, who's aground on Kodiak. The highest probability of
Let me make sure that they're working on it, so go ahead.
well, the highest probability of incident is clearly in the increased maritime traffic across the border. That is clearly the number one spot.
Is it because it's so multifaceted, it's just, you don't have one person to go to say, okay, here's what we need to do.
If you look at the work that we had with working with industry last year, we knew where all the ships were. We were all over them. We had people on board them. We inspected them. They were all covered by AIS. They were very informed.
They had a higher standard.
Higher standards. It was like we gang tackled that problem and drilling 2 holes in that Arctic last year. And they brought a lot of resources with them. You have 2 drilling rigs. Like I said, there was 22 vessels out there. All those other vessels are there to support that.
Right.
You don't have that when you have a liquid condensate vessel coming from the north slope of Alaska, of Russia, through the Bering Strait, unannounced, with unknown crew, and millions of gallons of product on board. Those things can seriously bother me. And I don't know what route they're taking, and they show up on our screen randomly.
Let me ask 2 quick questions, then I'll move to Slavey, and then we'll close up. But again, thank you for your patience here. With the activity that occurred this year, and you mentioned the comment that Arctic shows was kind of in perpetuity, different levels depending on activity, I'm assuming. But, do you feel like 2014, again, anticipating that Shell will be back in the waters as well as potentially ConocoPhillips, that you're prepared even under the sequestration levels that we're at, or is that a risk factor that we have to calculate in and do what we can, obviously, on our end? But that may have been an answer to your question by the question I gave you. But tell me kind of what you're thinking for 2014 with sequestration, with Shell, ConocoPhillips potentially. Now you have 2 kind of overlapping inside the region.
Senator, I would submit that Coast Guard activities in the region are going to grow and be persistent. Obviously changed by the amount of activity that goes on there, and oil and gas exploration is one part of that. If there's no more oil and gas exploration in the Arctic, the Coast Guard's presence will continue to grow there with all this other activity that we talked about. So we are attenuating our efforts based on the need that we see. That clearly, summer of 13, this coming summer, Coast Guard will be there. We'll have a national security cutter up there. We're looking to move a buoy tender up there. We're going to do some more experiments and exercise work. We've got a whole list of things we're going to continue to do, although oil and gas exploration is not going to be taking place like it did last year. So you can rest assured.
There'll still be activity there, but just in the level of training and testing, and also being aware because there's other activity outside of oil and gas going on.
Yes, sir. And this also actually gives us an opportunity to focus more on the Bering Strait. So we'll put a lot of assets in there, and we'll continue with our outreach with the local communities up there that we've started, and I think it's going very well. In the summer of 14, if Shell decides to drill, if ConocoPhillips shows up to drill, if our Canadian friends decide to move forward as they're planning on doing, if our Russian friends decide to do the same, and with Point Thompson, I think it's important for a lot of folks to realize Point Thompson is opening up. There's some 30 or 40 barges with a whole city that's going to go there to open up that field. That's all going to be lightered from offshore. That's all going to be international traffic that brings that there. Equipment's built in China and Singapore and other places will all have to come in, and the Coast Guard will be all over that because that provides lots of opportunity for accident. So the Coast Guard will be there in the summer of 13 and the summer of 14 and beyond. A lot more, I would suspect, in the summer of 14. Sequestration. Clearly, as Director Boudreau brought up, sequestration is an issue for all of us, and the Coast Guard, particularly D-17, is working hard to figure out how best to manage the risks and the impacts of sequestration. We have a reduction in our flight hours, and our offshore maritime activity is being reduced because of that. The exact impacts, I will be getting a briefing before the end of this week, actually tomorrow, from my staff on what how exactly they will recommend I adjust to that. So now, as far as 14 goes in sequestration, Senator, as you know, that could be a million years from now.
Right.
Yeah, everything's changing.
Instead of time, it is.
So we had a continuing resolution, then we had sequestration, now we got a new continuing resolution. We're still trying to balance all those books and see how we can do it. I will finally end with, this is a Coast Guard issue, Senator, and not just my issue here at D-17. It's an all hands on deck event for the United States Coast Guard around the nation. So forces do flow from elsewhere as we look to balance the Coast Guard activities to Alaska to address this. So it's not just myself out here trying to figure this out on my own. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Pete, thank you very much for being patient here. And I know because of limitations of the reports that are being done and the work that are done by different agencies you're responding to on the KULIC, let me ask you kind of, if I can ask you maybe a general question. You had an incredible operation at I think it was the Marriott, if I remember right, the incident command. And you had lots of pieces to it, lots of people, lots of other activities. Is in your process, and again, if you can't comment now, but in the process of when you prepare the reports for the different agencies, are you going to talk about what you can do to improve that, or was it what you thought it would be, or what can you tell us now? It seems to be a lot of people, but and I know you're probably doing internal analysis, I'm assuming, of how that went. There are some tweaks or changes could be made. Can you comment on any of that at this point, or is that something that has to be limited because of the work you're doing with the Justice Department as well as the Interior Department and Coast Guard?
We can comment on the response itself. It's really, I think, more out with the investigation. So
Sure.
we were very happy that we were able to stand up and bring all those folks together over New Year's and the period thereafter. As we said, actually a little over 700 people. We were able to mobilize assets that we had frankly put away for the winter. Our oil spill response capacity was located both in Seward and Dutch Harbor. Tremendous responses from some of our local companies here. You know, over the years, we've done a lot of oil spill training with folks at ASRC, their energy services, with UIC, with Alaska Clean Seas. And very, very quickly, within a matter of 2 or 3 days, we were literally able to take the snow off some of these assets in Seward and bring them up and mobilize them. And between the assets that were mobilized in Dutch and Seward, I think we're able to address a lot of the concerns that stakeholders had, that the incident command had in very short order. One of the things that worked very well, obviously, because of the proximity to Kodiak, was the access to the helicopters and the crews on those rescue helicopters. If this were to have been an incident in the slope, we would have been a little closer to where our air assets were. And finally, I'll say as well, from my industry partners, clearly the Coast Guard came through. We had a number of vessels that we were able to pull through, but we called and got a helicopter released from our colleagues at ExxonMobil in 17 minutes from the time we made the call.
So as you examine and as you move forward, you will probably do some internal recommendation as you improve that or enhance it. Is that a fair statement?
We worked an awful lot with the Coast Guard. Again, Captain Mailer and Admiral Ostapol will testify. We had a number of full call-out drills last year. We had 2 drills going into 2012 where we actually flew a number of folks up from out of state to help us in there. So we had practiced what was going on, and fortune favors the prepared. And I do feel that the success we had in getting the Kullik off the rocks was due to the work we had done with the Coast Guard, the state of Alaska, and with other federal agencies.
Let me ask you 2 quick questions that I'm going to have to close off. I'll have some more for you for the record. But one, you did a conflict avoidance agreement whaling captains and communities up there. Do you think that, how do you feel that worked out? Obviously, this would be from your perspective, but how do you think that worked in that kind of sitting down, working this out? Tell me your thoughts on that.
We think it worked pretty well. You know, we had talked in my testimony, Senator, about the fact that we weren't able to get our wells through hydrocarbon sessions. We obviously have reasons to do, that we couldn't do that. But one of the things that we had to work with was the whaling activities in the Beaufort. We had agreed through the conflict avoidance agreement that we would not engage in activities during whaling in Cross Island and what's going on in Kaktovik as well. Very difficult to do, but something that we said we would do and we honored.
Last question, Interagency Working Group, you had stated in the last time we had a hearing, your desire to, your sense was that it was working, but your desire was how do you make this more permanent? So it's not just at the whim of a current president or what might happen administratively. Is that still your position to see this more permanent, so there's some long-term structure?
Yes, absolutely. I think the work that Deputy Secretary Hayes did was excellent, and I'm sure Deputy Secretary Boudreau will continue down the same line. But we do need to make it sustainable through a number of different operators, through Conoco and Statoil, and eventually others that might come on. I think the work that's doing does need to survive political transition. Yeah, but it has been. It's been a sea change practically in how things have been done. And I also think that in a time of sequester and in a time where we're really looking to up the quality of permits, you're getting a better quality program at potentially a more efficient cost structure, and everybody benefits with that in place.
Very good. Let me end there, and I do have some other questions. I'll just submit them for the record if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Senator.
I appreciate all of you being here, and again, thank you for giving your testimony. We have your written testimony, and then I know Pete Slavey gave some recommendations, which I'm going to probably correspond with you on some of those thoughts there. So
thank you very much, Senator.
Thank you all very much. We'll dismiss this panel. We'll have the next panel assemble very quickly here, and Helen will be going to you first, so be prepared. Only that. The Commission, thank you very much. Let me go ahead and again thank the panel for being here. Thank you for participating. Again, you've got a sense if we can keep your testimony close to 5 minutes each, that'd be appropriate. And we'll start right off the bat. And again, this is our second panel, again talking about the Arctic in a broader sense. And again, we appreciate Helen Brohl, Executive Director, U.S. Committee on Marine Transportation System, being here on video teleconference. As I mentioned earlier, Helen, before you got on, that due to sequester and other budget reductions, we couldn't have you here in person. You're missing 70-degree summer weather here, no snow, but we think this is great that you're able to participate. The last testimony we had from Tommy Boudreau went very well. It works very clean. So again, thank you for your willingness to testify here and save a little money to the federal government. We like doing that. So again, appreciate your time. So I'll open with you, and if you want to go ahead with your testimony, we greatly appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just testing, you can hear me okay, sir?
We can hear you perfect.
Thank you so much. Chairman Begich, thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony today to you and the Senate Commerce Committee Subcommittee on Oceans, Atmosphere, Fisheries, and Coast Guard's field here in Anchorage. And thank you again for allowing us to participate by BTC from DOT headquarters in Washington. The Committee on the Marine Transportation System, or CMTS, originated as a federal cabinet-level interagency committee established at the direction of the President in 2004. This past December, Congress institutionalized the committee as statute in the Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation Act of 2012. The CMTS includes 28 member departments, independent agencies, and White House offices, including DHS and Coast Guard and folks from the Department of Interior. The Secretary of Transportation serves as the chair. The CMTS has identified that the U.S. Marine Transportation System is within the purview of over 35 individual federal agencies. The purpose of the CMTS is to assess the adequacy of the marine transportation system, which includes ports, waterways, channels, and intermodal connections, and to promote the integration of the MTS with other modes of transportation and other uses of the marine environment, and coordinate recommendations with regard to federal policies that impact the MTS. The United States is an Arctic nation. As climate change, including the loss of sea ice, create a more accessible Arctic, we must consider the need for future action and guidance that will facilitate safe and efficient navigation, prevent loss of life and property, reduce the risk of environmental damage to the region, and preserve way of life for native Alaskan tribes. For this reason, the U.S. Arctic MTS should be capable of meeting the safety, security, and environmental protection needs of present and future Arctic stakeholders and activities. Under Section 307 of the Coast Guard Authorization Act of 2010, the CMTS was directed to coordinate the establishment of domestic transportation policies in the Arctic. This coordination includes the consideration of national policies and guidance related to safe and secure maritime shipping in the Arctic. To advance this coordination, the CMTS created an interagency action team to oversee the development of a draft report titled The U.S. Arctic Marine Transportation System Overview and Priorities for Action in 2003. This draft report is currently on the CMTS website at www.cmts.gov for public inspection with a 45-day comment period, which ends on April 22nd. The CMTS expects to finalize the report once public comments have been compiled and assessed. The draft CMTS Arctic MTS report identifies existing Arctic MTS policies, assesses present and projected uses of the Arctic, describes the essential components of a U.S. Arctic MTS, describes the potential benefits of a U.S. Arctic MTS, provides an evaluation of the current conditions of the U.S. Arctic MTS, and recommends actions through which the CMTS member agencies, working with stakeholders, strengthen the MTS to meet the nation's goal for safe Arctic economic activity and environmental protection. As part of its assessment, the CMTS identified 5 components and 16 sub-elements of the U.S. Arctic MTS. The 5 main components include navigable waterways, which includes things like places of refuge for ships, physical infrastructure such as geodetic control infrastructure, MTS information infrastructure such as hydrographic surveys, MTS response surveys such as escort services and ice breaking, and vessels, including crew standards and training. For each of the 16 sub-elements within these 5 components, the draft report includes a description of the issue, its status, associated challenges, current federal activities, and future federal action is needed. These issue papers are located under Chapter 3 and also identifying non-federal partners. Taken together, the Arctic MTS issue papers recognize the Arctic MTS as a nascent system that would need considerable public-private investment to support increased Arctic traffic if projected future growth in regional and trans-Arctic shipping is realized. As it has been stated, changing conditions in the Arctic create an opportunity for the United States to develop a new Arctic marine transportation system. Working cooperatively with federal, state, local, and tribal authorities, the MTS may be sustainably managed to the benefit of all stakeholders. CMTS, in its draft U.S. Arctic MTS Review and Actions report, puts forward short-term and long-term recommendations and a comprehensive strategy to address the development of the Arctic MTS and supporting elements across all MTS components and stakeholders. I would like to note that many of these recommendations are complementary to the soon-to-be-released National Ocean Policy Implementation Plan. If an Arctic MTS is to be developed, the CMTS recognizes the interdependent nature of marine transportation system elements and recommends that the United States first focus to improve the Arctic MTS in two primary MTS component areas. These are information infrastructure, including sea ice and marine weather forecasts, mapping and charting, communications, and AIS coverage, and response services, including environmental response management, search and rescue, and ice breaking capability. While not yet final, an appropriate mix of MTS services are called for in the MTS report to bridge existing gaps and provide a safe, secure, and environmentally sound MTS to address the full range of issues impacting the U.S. Arctic and the Arctic region at large. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate, again, the opportunity to testify, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, and it came across very well, and we could hear you perfect. So again, thank you. Be patient here as we go through a couple more testimonies, and I'll come back to you first for questions. So we will recognize your time and limitations. Next person I have is Ed Page, Executive Director, Marine Exchange of Alaska. And I've visited your facility, and it's impressive what you're doing down there. So please.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today on these pressing issues in Alaska. Having served in the maritime profession in Alaska for over 24 years as a prior Coast Guard officer and presently as Executive Director of the Marine Exchange of Alaska, I've seen firsthand the changes in maritime activity in Alaska and appreciate the importance of ensuring safe, environmentally sound, and maritime operations in the Arctic. I've sailed in Coast Guard vessels, oil tankers, container ships, fishing vessels, tugs, oil exploration support vessels, spill response vessels, cruise ships, and cargo ships in Alaska waters. I can attest to the fact that operating in water does, in fact, present some unique challenges, and have responded to search and rescue cases where mariners have perished, as well as numerous oil spills, including the Exxon Valdez oil spill. I recognize the need for having better information on vessels' locations, or maritime domain awareness, which is what the common term used, aid both prevention and response to maritime casualties.
Hold it there.
Yes, sir.
There's someone's, whichever one that is. Is that yours? Yeah. It's new technology. Sorry, Ed. Please go ahead. That will embarrass Jim for a long time.
Well, serving as a captain of port for Los Angeles Long Beach. The Coast Guard and I, in the capacity as captain of port, partnered with the Legacy Marine Exchange of Southern California, which is also a nonprofit organization, the state of California, to build and operate a vessel traffic system for that port area that utilized a 25-mile radar, which certainly is not adequate for Alaska waters. But the model of shared marine industry and government partnership is, in fact, the model that has been taken and brought up to Alaska. But through the enormity of our state, the Marine Exchange of Alaska utilized emerging and newer technologies, including the use of automatic identification systems, or AIS, acronym, and satellite tracking technology that is largely funded today by the maritime industry, the state of Alaska, and the Coast Guard. As adopted by the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, most vessels engaging in international trade require to be equipped with AIS transponders that broadcast the vessel location, type, speed, course, and other valuable information several times a minute over VHF radio frequencies. This data substantially enhances maritime safety as received and processed by other vessels in the area, as well as by shore and satellite AIS receivers. And this information is disseminated to the Coast Guard, state agencies, and to the maritime community. In 2005, the Marine Exchange has built and operates today over 95 AIS receiving sites in Alaska, extending throughout the Arctic, out the Aleutian Islands, and down to Ketchikan. This system is providing historical and real-time information on vessels' locations, has been used in coordinated responses to vessel distress and to locate vessels that are a source of oil spills. Most recently, it was used by the Coast Guard and Shell during the drill platform Kullik incident in Alaska. The system also monitors compliance with vessel speed restrictions in well-protected areas. It triggers alerts to prevent the presence of both high-profile vessels and aircraft in the flight path of the Kodiak Airport, and alarms when vessels set anchor on underwater fiber cables serving Alaska so they can know where to effect the repairs. In fact, Shell Oil has been one of the more proactive users of the system and has employed the Marine Exchange to send alerts when their contracted vessels approach the vicinity of areas that are restricted by permits issued to do the drilling. When a vessel approaches restricted areas, the Marine Exchange 24-hour operations center alerted both the vessel operator and Shell. As a result of this proactive measure, there were no incursions in Ledyard Bay this past year. Marine Exchange's Arctic Network has provided information on vessel activity over the last several years to the Coast Guard and other agencies to assess the extent of increasing traffic and the risks that they present. Our system tracks vessels and reaches across to Russian waters and receives the AIS transmissions of all vessels equipped with AIS that are transiting the Bering Strait to and from the Arctic. So many of the reports that you see and the graphics of traffic through the Arctic, as you well know, Senator, are from the Marine Exchange's vessel tracking system. It's actually somewhat difficult to define actual traffic activity because there are many different ways of counting vessels and metrics and whether a ship is tugged and what have you. As noted earlier, there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 vessels that have gone through the Bering Strait this past year. And it's reflecting a modest increase over the last several years as we've tracked it for about 5 years now. Each year there's more vessels going across and different types of vessels going across. And most recently, exploration vessels. And of course, Russia is now bringing more vessels across the continent. And while the risks presented by maritime traffic really do exist, I think they're somewhat modest when you compare it to ports of Seattle and San Francisco and LA, provided that in those places, where there's Coast Guard monitoring, oversight, and presence, there's also the same in the Arctic. Certainly the Coast Guard is much like a policeman on the highway. Their presence influences behavior of vessel operators and ensures compliance with various regulations and safety standards. And I feel this is the appropriate time to start implementing this risk reduction method, not after an accident, but before they happen. So this focus of hearings such as this are certainly appropriate and timely. And we reflect back, there was no government surveillance when the Exxon Valdez ran aground in 1989 because the vessels sailed past the Coast Guard's radar coverage. Of course, today, there's complete coverage provided by IS of Prince William Sound. So it is under the watchful eye of the Coast Guard. And vessels' behavior is influenced accordingly. Areas where I find some improvements in maritime safety in the Arctic can be realized are expanding the Coast Guard AIS carriage requirements for vessels to all commercial vessels, and not only for vessels engaged in international trade. There were regulations drafted some 4 years ago by the Coast Guard to address this issue. In fact, other nations around the world have done so. But today, the regulations do not require most of those vessels operating up in the Arctic, it's on domestic trade, the shell vessels in particular, they're not required to have AIS. The vessels are exceeding the regulatory requirements by having AIS on board, allowing that visibility. Regulations should be published. The draft regulations should be published to provide a level playing field that ensure all vessels operating in the Arctic have AIS. And this, in turn, will allow the Coast Guard to monitor surveillance and ensure compliance with various safety requirements. And this concept comports with the 1989 International Arctic Maritime Shipping Assessment that recommended, I believe 1999 actually, or 2009, sorry, that recommended all commercial vessels operating in the Arctic be equipped with AIS. So it's not just Ed Page saying this, others have also found the merit of AIS. AIS is also, from the outset, designed to provide two-way communications. In other words, you can disseminate safety information over the same system. It has greater range, it's clear, it's digital, and can provide more information. In our case, we've developed, working with the Alaska Ocean Observing System, to provide some support and funding, the capability. We've bought the equipment, we tested it, and we've demonstrated it works to send ice information, weather information to vessels over AIS. However, we can't receive the permits to do it. So even though we can't turn it on, we have turned it on and tested it, but we can't legally turn it on and send this information out because we can't get the permits to do so, even though it's been done in Europe. I believe that the agency should be more proactive in facilitating this ability to provide safety information to vessels with this newer technology. That would enhance maritime safety in that region as well as in other regions. Lastly, I believe the implementation of long-delayed Coast Guard non-tank vessel regulations, which seem to be having some movement as of late, will reduce the risk and consequences of oil spills, as the regulation will require cargo and other non-tank vessels contribute to the commercial oil spill prevention and response capabilities in Alaska. Right now, these regulations only apply to tankers, and they're footing the bill, and they pay for the response capabilities. But we can expand capabilities if and when non-tank vessels are also required. And of course, there's a law that passed by Congress 10 years ago, I believe. So I think it's time to implement the regulations. Work is not done to marine exchange. There are many more AI stations that we need to build and increase the range of, as well as fully implement the weather sensors and weather transmitters and safety information to vessels, those capabilities. If it was not for the Coast Guard, the state of Alaska, and the marine industry's shared commitment to improve maritime safety, this system simply would not exist. This private-public partnership is a cost-effective solution that no other government agency or contractor was willing or able to do, and this operation maintenance of a 24-hour operation center and extensive tracking network has provided a total cost of about $2.5 million per year. Those end my comments.
Thank you very much, Ed. Next, we have Eleanor Huffins, Manager, U.S. Arctic Campaign, Pew Charitable Trust. Eleanor.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. As an initial matter, Pew is very appreciative of your continued focus on the Arctic. And in fact, in a July 2012 letter to the President, you and Senator Murkowski both rightly identified the need for the U.S. to develop a comprehensive U.S. Arctic policy to better address the challenges and opportunities we're facing in the region. And so we're very supportive of that initiative. The future of the Arctic does not need to be an endless battle over perceived trade-offs between culture, environment, and the economics. Developing a plan that addresses the full range of human activities and their interactions with the environment creates an opportunity to assess and address the multiple stressors already present or projected to start or increase from vessel traffic, offshore energy, and shipping. To be effective, Pew believes a comprehensive U.S. Arctic policy must be driven by 4 guiding principles. Yeah, I have a lot of very important things to say. To be effective, Pew believes a U.S. policy should be driven by 4 guiding principles. And many of these principles have been mentioned in testimony earlier today, but we believe they're so significant they should be repeated. So I apologize for some of the repetition you all will experience. First, local communities must have a meaningful voice in decision-making. Residents of Arctic communities are an integral part of the region's rich ecosystem. The federal government must ensure meaningful opportunities for local governments, tribes, co-management organizations, regional nonprofits, and ANCSA corporations are involved from the beginning of decision-making. The federal government is required to consult fully with Alaska Native tribes on a government-to-government basis. And any governance framework needs to incorporate consultation and traditional knowledge well in advance of management decisions, including a strategy for sharing information and providing feedback about Indigenous concerns back to them in the region before the decisions are announced. Second, a comprehensive U.S. Arctic policy should include an understanding that ecosystem health is essential for maintaining a subsistence way of life, and that areas of the ocean are important for maintaining ecosystem integrity and function. Those areas must be safeguarded. For many residents of the Arctic, there's a direct connection between the continued health of the marine environment and the health of their food supply, their culture, and themselves. The federal government must take a careful look at potential impacts to subsistence resources and show its commitment towards ensuring these resources are protected. Areas within an ecosystem are not equal in ecological terms. Some areas contribute disproportionately to ecosystem structure and functioning. Important ecological areas may include places that are important for subsistence, that are used for maintaining the viability of a species, or contribute disproportionately to an ecosystem's productivity, biodiversity, or resilience. The federal government needs to undertake a process to identify and protect these areas in the Bering, Beaufort, and Chukchi seas. Thirdly, science must guide decision-making. To make informed management decisions, it will be critical to have a better understanding of the cumulative effects of climate change, ocean acidification, and industrial stresses in the marine environment, and how these stresses interact with one another to affect the ecosystem, species, and the people of the region. Developing a vigorous and lasting monitoring program will be essential to generate reliable information and reduce the degree of uncertainty in the knowledge of our Arctic ecosystem. There has been significant progress in the past 2 years in information and data gathered in efforts by both government and industry, including synthesis efforts like PACMARS and SOAR. Yet, despite these efforts, the Arctic marine environment remains a difficult place to study and understand. Senate Bill 272 your bill, the Arctic Research Monitoring and Observing Act of 2013 offers several solutions to these challenges. If passed, the bill's provisions could form the backbone of a long-term research and monitoring program, something that Pew has long advocated for in the Arctic. And finally, as part of the government's commitment to developing Alaska resources cautiously and subject to the highest safety and environmental standards, Arctic-specific oil spill prevention response standards must be developed and applied to all companies operating in the region, both for all industrial activities, including offshore oil and gas and vessel traffic. These standards should account for the area's remote location, lack of infrastructure, and unique operating conditions due to severe and changing climate. The Ocean Energy Safety Advisory Committee recommendations and the Department of Interior's review represent a welcome first step towards identifying necessary safety and system improvements. These 4 core principles should serve as the foundation for any U.S. Arctic policy or management decision. And given the limited amount of time here today, I cannot do the region, the people, or the issues justice, so I respectfully request that you refer to our written testimony for very specific recommendations on strengthening Alaska's offshore oil and gas program and enhancing vessel traffic in the Bering Strait. Not the traffic, the safety of the traffic in the Bering Strait and Arctic Ocean. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and you did have some in your document, some good ideas, some good suggestions. I appreciate that. Thank you. What I'd like to now ask is Matt Gainley, Vice President of Bering Straits Native Corporation. Matt.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, on behalf of the shareholders.
I'm going to pause you for a second because this is saying, let's swap those two. There you go. I can tell it's on.
On behalf of the shareholders and Board of Directors of Bering Straits Native Corporation, which I'll refer to as BSNC, just a short things, I thank you for the opportunity to present testimony related to developments in Alaska's Arctic waters. I'm Matt Gailey, Vice President of Resources and External Affairs for Bering Straits Native Corporation. I've worked in Western Alaska and Northwest Alaska for the past 30 years, the last 20 of those years with Bering Straits Native Corporation. Bering Straits Native Corporation is a regional corporation established pursuant to the ANCSA, or the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971. The region encompasses the Seward Peninsula and adjacent waters, including Sledge Island, King and Diamond Islands, and the shorelines of 2 seas, as well as the whole shoreline of Norton Sound. 17 villages are within the BSNC regional organization. Traveling north to south along the shoreline, we have Shishmaref on the Chukchi Sea, Wales and Diamond on Bering Strait, Teller and Brevik Mission on the eastern boundary of Port Clarence, Nome on the Bering Sea, then further east to Solomon Gulf and Koyuk, south to Shaktoolik, Unalakleet, Stebbins, and St. Michael, all within Norton Sound. Recent developments including diminished sea ice, increased vessel traffic through the Northern Sea Route Northwest Passage, and oil and gas exploration in the Beaufort and Chukchi, including Russian waters to the west, have rapidly brought Bering Straits region into sharp focus. Though certainly challenging, we view these developments with concern as well as guarded optimism. Over the past 2 years, agencies and organizations have held meetings to discuss numerous topics related to increased shipping and vessel traffic in northern waters. From one gathering to the next, I've watched as the anxiety level has risen among participants of these meetings who are attending as representatives from the coastal communities in Bering Straits. Discussions and reports detailing spill and disaster response needs, increased traffic related to exploration, as well as the potential for offshore oil development, have not addressed a glaring gap between the information scenarios presented and the utility of that information to the resident stakeholders. Strategies, however, have been developed, specifically, and I'll refer to this as a state program called the Geographic Response Strategy, which, if implemented in a material sense, would place the tools and expertise in the hands of communities to respond at the local level to fuel spills and unanticipated discharges in nearshore marine waters. Staging of the necessary hardware in the communities, combined with the proper training, would provide communities with an investment in what is occurring in their neighborhoods. It would also give communities an active role in protecting the subsistence resource base, the very thing that the residents are the most anxious about. I offer the GRS as an example because it highlights something that BSNC has been emphasizing in recent discussions related to the Arctic waters. There is no single location or, for that matter, response plan that is going to fulfill the many needs facing industry, government, and the residents of the Arctic. The extent of the coastline, the lack of intermodal transportation, the extreme environment, and the relative absence of sufficient deep water require a non-centralized modular approach to infrastructure development in the Arctic. Rather than focus on a single core for port development with the intent of constructing the Arctic core, we encourage agencies, planners, and government, both state and federal, to promulgate rules and encourage private development as well as the public-private partnerships discussed in the recent port studies. It would also be prudent when legislation is developed to be certain that, one, not all of the resources are invested for political expediency at one location, and two, that the options available for port development, particularly in the private sector, are not necessarily restricted through new or additional administrative regimes. Since its creation in 1971 with the passage of the Alaska Native Land Claims Settlement Act, BSNC has endeavored to anticipate what would occur in the region with regards to resource development and commerce. This was the underlying intent of the infrastructure imposed by the Act. BSNC's selected land is located at Point Spencer, commonly known as Point Clarence, in 1976, pursuant to Section 14H8 of ANCSA, and we subsequently prioritized its tract 10 years ago. It was selected with the understanding that BSNC would accept conveyance at such time as it became available. Until 2010, the year that the Coast Guard decommissioned the Lorraine facility, Port Clarence served as an important link in the communication navigation system for Alaska's waters. We've been working with the Coast Guard and have had initial discussions with the Department of Natural Resources to determine the most expedient manner to have property conveyed to BSNC to fulfill the corporation's ANCSA entitlement. As we all know, there are currently no adequate staging support disaster response facilities in the area of Bering Strait, and BSNC intends to utilize this property for infrastructure development that will positively benefit the shipping safety, search and rescue capabilities, security, and economic development in the region. It will also provide jobs and economic opportunities in one of the most economically depressed areas of the United States. We believe Port Clarence can be responsibly developed in partnership with private industry to meet the needs of marine safety and national security throughout Alaska's northern Arctic waters. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And again, I'll have questions for several of you, but next person is Jack, is again, Oliak, Alaska Nanuk Commission Executive Director. Thank you very much, Jack, for being here.
Everybody hear me? Yes. First of all, good morning, Senator Begich. It's a pleasure to meet you. I appreciate the opportunity to testify on this behalf. My name is Jack O'Mealik. I'm the Executive Director of the Alaska Nanuk Commission. We represent 15 coastal villages from Kaktovik to St. Lawrence Island in the domestic and international management of polar bears. Recently, the Alaska Nanuk Commission took part in the formation of the Arctic Marine Mammal Coalition. The members of this coalition include the Alaska Nanuk Commission, the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission, the Eskimo Walrus Commission, the Alaska Beluga Whale Committee, and the IC Committee. We primarily represent the groups through the Bering Strait and the Beaufort Sea. I'd just like to speak briefly. I'm going to go ahead and abridge my verbal presentation. I've given you a complete written testimony. But I'd like to speak briefly on some points of concern to the groups as in regards to the increase in traffic through the straits. Of course, our concerns are about the potential impacts in regards to our long-term food security. It's primarily the reason why we decided to come together and form the AMC. Our goal as this coalition is to speak more efficiently as a unified voice. We all know about the difficulty it is to reach stakeholders. This is one of the primary reasons why we decided such an agency should be formed, to increase the communication between local stakeholders and people such as yourself. So in 2012, in September, we got together and met, formed the coalition, and then sent a letter to the U.S. Coast Guard 17th District, making recommendations on vessel management measures as part of the process to develop the port access route study. A copy of this letter is also attached to my written testimony. So the main points that we agreed to in this letter was that we felt it would be necessary to establish areas to be avoided, protecting the subsistence use areas and coastal communities. We also think we need to deploy receivers and computer monitors in villages so that residents can track vessels using the AIS system, which was spoken to earlier. Ship strikes on whales, especially bowheads, are a very serious concern to the residents of the whaling communities. For this reason, we would like to see recommendations for speed restrictions for vessels transiting the Bering and the Nadir Straits during the spring and fall migratory periods. To protect marine mammals during biologically important activities, we would like to see recommendations for speed restrictions and possible diversionary measures in the presence of feeding marine mammals. I'd like to note here that these recommendations for speed restrictions and diversionary measures is patterned after mitigation measures in the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission's Open Water Season Conflict Avoidance Agreement. This new coalition's work is focused primarily on commercial traffic vessels, but I think it's relevant to state that the oil and gas operators working in the Arctic have been willing to adhere to these measures during vessel transit for many years. Also, to maintain the health of our waters, we feel very strongly that commercial vessels should be required to treat the Bering, Chukchi, and Beaufort seas as zero discharge zones for ballast water and vessel waste. Given the lack of infrastructure and the relatively limited Coast Guard presence, providing emergency response training and equipment to our coastal communities should be part of any program aimed at emergency response in the Arctic. Finally, Senator, we all know that it's absolutely critical that funding for these types of issues are addressed. We're committed to the safety and well-being of our residents, our subsistence resources, as well as the many humans transiting our ocean now and in the future. I'm pleased to report that on January 30th of this year, the Arctic Marine Mammal Coalition received a response to our letter from Admiral Ostabo. The Admiral's letter offers several very helpful recommendations for opportunities to pursue the types of management measures we have recommended. The Admiral also expressed interest in further collaboration with our communities and our coalition. We're grateful for this response and intend to pursue on behalf of our subsistence hunters both the Coast Guard's recommendations and the Admiral's offer for further collaborations. This letter is attached to my comments. Thank you again, Senator, for the opportunity. And on behalf of the marine mammal hunters of our Arctic coastal communities, I'd like to express our sincere gratitude for your recognition of the fact of allowing us to be here to give testimony today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your testimony. Thank you all five of you for your testimony. Let me start, if I can, Helen. I know, again, time restrictions on the VTC, so let me ask you a couple of quick questions. I'm going to note that you had mentioned on MTS services two things that were important, response services as well as information sharing. That's kind of one of the two priorities that you wanted to do. Keeping that in mind, under the sequestration for all the agencies that are being impacted, how does this or will this impact your ability to move forward in that arena, those specific issues, but also will it impact other work you're trying to do around the Arctic analysis and information you're gathering?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Certainly, the limitation in funds has impacted the way in which you can address funding for the entire national marine transportation system, as well as the Arctic MTS. And respective MTS-related federal agencies are addressing the ways in which they can make positive improvements under the limited funding. It's our hope that the CMTS report and the infrastructure investment work that we're doing under another integrated action team under the CMTS provides foundational information from which agencies or the White House can determine their priorities under the limited funding.
Do you, let me ask you on the infrastructure, because we'll have some additional questions here about infrastructure and ports. I know in Russia's case, they're making some significant investments on the Northern Sea route, establishing 10 rescue centers kind of throughout their region. When you talk about the report and the work you're doing, both with what we just talked about, the NTS, but also the other integrated agencies working together, do you see this as part of the need? I think Matt said it very clearly. It's not about necessarily one port or one super port. It's about kind of a sequence of resources available. Is that how DOT sees it, or give me a sense here? I know the report's still being worked on with other agencies, but give me your sense of how you see the infrastructure for the Arctic, not only from an oil and gas perspective, but the shipping and other things that might be going on.
So the CMTS is obviously interdepartmental, and while collectively we can make recommendations on priorities for infrastructure that we have mentioned, ultimately the individual departments must deal with it under their own prioritization and the normal federal budget process. One of the things, our goals with developing this report, was to really collect all the information from all of the agencies and departments, all of the federal policies, and have them in one spot in order to take that more holistic look rather than just agency by agency. Ultimately, though, we hope that the White House work on a national strategy, an Arctic strategy, will help to reinforce those priorities from which a solid budget, a more holistic budget, can perhaps be developed.
I know that.
I'm sorry, I was going to say, with regard to looking at what other nations are doing, we clearly looked at all the reports of activities of the Arctic nations. It certainly informed our report, provided the basic information from which we determined what is the current and future trends for the Arctic. Certainly we're aware of the infrastructure capabilities of, let's say, Russia with regard to ice-breaking capabilities. But our report in particular is not an implementation plan, so we can't say exactly what percentage of dollars would go to the Arctic MTS compared to, let alone the national MTS as compared to individual priorities of respective agencies. We can tell you, though, that there is a real groundswell within the federal government to address this in a holistic manner. The timing on our report has informed other federal reports, including the Integrated Arctic Management Report that may have been mentioned by the Department of Interior. It's informing the strategic Arctic strategy being developed by the National Security Staff at the White House. It is complementary to the National Ocean Policy Implementation Plan. To get to your original point, there are restricted funds. There are lots of big issues to consider. We hope that our reports provide enough basic information so the powers that be can look at it as a system and prioritize accordingly.
So just to make sure I got this right, I know Undersecretary Hayes is working on a broader Arctic policy for the White House and developing that through the Secretary's office and the Interior Department. Yours will feed into that to some degree, along with others, to develop this longer range policy, which will include infrastructure as a piece of it. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, sir.
Very good. Thank you very much. Let me move, if I can. Eleanor, thank you very much again for your recommendations and your written testimony. Give me a sense from your perspective as an NGO kind of looking in, watching what's going on in the Arctic. Do you think the relationship between the oil and gas industry, local communities, has been adequate? And I'll use Shell first, and that's the one that's kind of been on the ground the longest, I guess I would say. Others have been on the ground, but I mean the Arctic development and engaging local communities. Do you think that's been adequate? Do you think there should be some standards that we need to implement in order to ensure that other companies do the same thing? Or is that naturally happening because the pressures to be by local community groups really kind of putting the pressure on them? Is that, tell me your sense of that.
Well, I can provide my sense, but I should say I obviously cannot speak for the communities or the hunters, so I can.
Don't worry, I'm going to ask Jack the same
Right, I can
question.
share my perspective based
So
on.
if your answer is wrong, Jack will correct
Jack, I hope you will correct me. I will share what I've learned from people and what they've shared with me. I think there are some positive steps. One of the challenges is that one of the success stories has been the conflict avoidance agreement, but that's very specific to bowhead whales in the Beaufort.
Right.
And so I think that that is a model that has been successful, and the whalers will tell you that there have been some positive changes from that. The difficulty is, as Jack mentioned, there are a great deal of other very important species for marine mammals and for marine mammal subsistence hunters. And that doesn't get at the challenges of the migration through the Bering Strait and noise and cumulative effects. And so I think there are models that have worked in an isolated incident for an isolated species, but looking more broadly at cumulative effects of the traffic in more than one company and more than one sea, if you're operating the Chukchi and the Beaufort and going through the Bering Strait, we have not yet been successful. I also say that there has been, every community is different, and so every community has different perspectives, and some people will say there's been success and some people will say there hasn't been. So I would reference that additional species, cumulative effects, additional consultation is still needed.
Do you think what's been going on with the bowhead whale in the sense of the work with the whaling captains is a base model that can be used, especially in the shipping, as we deal with shipping issues? Is that a model that might be utilized with shippers? Again, as an example of something that's, at least in the broader sense, is working. May have some fine-tuning.
Yeah, again, I would defer to Jack and the marine mammal co-management organizations, but I think as a model it has at least produced some good mitigation measures. It hasn't addressed the broader issue of where in the ocean are subsistence areas to be avoided in the broader context of that model addresses mitigation. It doesn't address the broader context of some places for resting, feeding, critical habitat where there is no activity. So I think you need to do both mitigation and protection of some areas.
And I think I know the answer to this, so I'm just going to say it, and I think I know your answer, and that is thank you for mentioning SB 272, but I think on all research, a continual known funding stream is what's critical, because without it, it's kind of a statement, I think you're not going to be yes, but without it, you have this ups and downs in research. So you might set a pattern, have some money for it, and then 2 years later, through whatever act of Congress, we delete it.
Right.
Now that research gets interrupted, which really, when you're trying to do this long-term research on habitat, it's a longer-term view, not a 1 year plan or a 2 year plan. It's multi-year. So you have trend lines. Is that how you see it? And I just want to make sure I'm on the same path.
No, I totally agree. And I think one of the challenges the scientists will tell you, and they talked about this at the National Academy Research Project last week, is that in the Arctic in particular, there's varying seasons and varying years. And so you really need a long-term monitoring, cumulative effects approach to really be successful in managing the resource.
And that's one of your 4 points, if I remember
Yes.
right, correct? Yeah. Good. Let me, if I can, I'll move to Jack, and then after I'm done, I'll go to Matt. Jack, I want to follow up on that. Give me your perspective. And I think your comments, and you had some good recommendations, and I think that's what triggered my thinking on this, that my sense is from your comments is that there's some activity going on with the whaling captains, but when you talk about the shipping corridor, there's not as much going on there with the shippers, and that's a glaring gap. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, thank you, Senator. That's true. One of the things I wrote down here, it's relatively easy to sit up here and talk about things that are going wrong. It's much more difficult to provide solutions.
I know. I understand. Please come to Washington.
Anyways, we agree. There are other agencies who have taken the lead on this. And I think the reason why that we've decided to form this Marine Mammal Coalition and modeled it sort of after the relationship that the EWC has is, as co-management agencies, we're sort of bound to this limited perspective of federal and international resource management. So take, for instance, the Alaska Nanuk Commission says we're concerned about increased shipping. development and its impacts on other things, and the Department of Interior says that's something for the Department of Commerce. And we take our issues to the Department of Commerce, and they say that's something for the Department of Interior. So
I feel you.
So we think this is an opportunity for the Marine Mammal Coalition to address these broader impacts. The reason why this is so difficult is there are so many elements of society wrapped up in this international shipping. We've not just got elements of culture, but economics as well, international relationships. So this Marine Mammal Coalition, we understand how key it is in these changing times that federal and international agencies need to speak with groups that sort of are unified, because we can't reach everybody. So the message is we're trying to break out of our rigid resource management strategies and address these broader issues. So we are going to follow the lead with the EWC. I hope I've answered your question.
You have, and you just made me think of something. I know, Helen, I told you I wouldn't ask you another question, but I'm wondering, is your group connected with the U.S. Marine, U.S. Committee on Marine Transportation System that Helen's part of? Helen, do you tap into this group at all, this new organization that's going to be formed?
No, sir. We do not currently. We probably would tap through our member agencies such as NOAA or Department of Interior agencies. But I've made a note of it, including some of the other recommendations today. We are doing some strategic planning overall for the marine transportation system, and this is certainly information I will take back to those members.
That's good. I was trying to make a connection here because it seemed that you've done something, Jack, that's very unique in a way to bring all these different organizations together. I know from our office, we deal with them individually. They come in, and one group has one view, one has another view, and having them in a coordinated effort, especially around the shipping issue, I think is going to be very beneficial for us as we move forward on marine transportation through the agency, as well as connected to the Arctic and the broader sense, both for shipping. So I'm very impressed with the group. So I didn't mean to interrupt you, but you were about to say something additional to.
I think there's just two key points that I should mention. One, the Arctic Marine Mammal Coalition was just formally established after ratification through our own agencies in December.
Okay, so very new.
We did produce this document in September. Then secondly, we have begun the process. I think we've been working with the Coast Guard here.
Excellent. Well, you can count on our ability and whatever we can do to help connect, make some more. I'm glad you've done this in a longer viewpoint. Because of time, Matt, let me ask you, I know, I appreciate your comment regarding the idea, let's not make it, I think you're, can't remember exact words, but kind of a legislative fix versus, just pour it all into one port and hope it all works out. And I think what I heard and gathered from your testimony is there's port clearance is one piece of the equation, but not the answer only by itself. But there's a sequence of ports that will ensure our ability to better manage the Bering Sea, and also, to be frank with you, to attract business to our shores rather than to the shores of Russia and elsewhere. Is that a fair statement?
Fair statement. And I think there's a lot of environmental drivers there too. The strait itself, the ice-free period is a bit longer south of the strait. Makes sense for something to be there. And then, of course, with the drilling, the Chukchi and Beaufort, you've got to have facilities and infrastructure there for response and safety.
And how is your, if you can give me just a quick update, I know we attempted toward the end of the last session trying to move forward on a land swap and arrangement with the Coast Guard and others. Can you give me a sense, is that moving forward?
Yes, and what we're doing now is we're in this discussion phase with the Coast Guard, and we'll open up formal discussions to, the concern, of course, is budget with everybody. But the concern also is what is the mission of Coast Guard in the future, and I think the Admiral touched on that today. I said he does see this increasing presence with oil exploration or without it because of shipping. And so they need to be, I really don't want to speak for the Coast Guard, but I think the need there is to ensure some footprint there. And so we're discussing,
How to accomplish both.
how to accomplish both. And from our standpoint at Bering Straits, safety is a huge issue, response is a huge issue, and there really isn't anything there now. And unless that land is brought into play in some way, and the only really expedient way to do that is for conveyance to Bering Straits at this point in time, because we don't know what the budget's going to bring for other developments there.
Let me ask you, and you might have caught my comments to the legislature regarding port development, and we introduced a piece of legislation to put together a Arctic port development strategy with loan guarantees up to $3 billion worth, because we think the need is multifaceted in the Arctic, and we can't just throw nickels and dimes at it and hope it all works out at the end of the day. We have to be robust about it, and I challenged the state legislature, which of course I'm sure they were excited to hear from me on this, that they need to put some money on the table, and I suggested upwards to $2 billion, because when you do these port developments, it's a combination of private sector money, equity, some free capital grants, and reasonable cost loans. Is that a fair statement of how we can manage this? And I don't know how we build this network without some larger state participation. And I know some legislators thought they were doing a lot the last bond they did, which was, I supported the bond, but it seemed to be small in the big picture of what we need to do here, not just for the Bering Sea, but all the other port activity throughout Alaska that's developing. Is that, these are not small projects.
No, these are not small projects. But I think the point needs to be made too here with Bering Straits involvement is that, in discussions we thought, okay, if this part of the exit selection, this is going to be important. It's like, I think the elders, many of them that are gone now, knew this in the 70s, that this is.
Elders had a lot of wisdom that we should have paid attention
Yeah,
to.
selected in 77. And, I think if the property had been released longer ago by the Coast Guard or whatever, if it was in Bering Straits, it is at this point in time, is that there would be something occurring there now.
Some development.
There is enough interest, on the part of interested industry to have the safeguards in place and have staging areas and have laydown areas that I think, public funding, public partnerships, equity. These are all really, they're important long range, but I think that there's enough momentum here with what's going on in the Arctic. As I said, I think about a year ago at a previous meeting, industry moves quite a bit faster than government.
And I think in this building, down one of the buildings in the UA campus, I think you talked about port expansion.
And we're pursuing this. We think it's in the interest of the region and the nation. And the shipping is. I think we're in the same position as the Coast Guard. It's regardless of oil development, the shipping is going to increase. We need to get things in place there that are going to be some economic advantages for the region. The region needs industry of some type,
right?
But also provide a safety net for what is occurring there as far as commerce goes.
Very good. Let me, before I ask Ed, I got one quick question for you. Helen, your clock is about to expire because I saw a 1 minute thing come up in front of us, and I want to just thank you in advance for being here. Thank you for participating, and we'll have probably some additional questions for you for the record. There we go. She was disconnected. I tried my best to be quick. I got senatoritis, which means time is longer. But thank her. Ed, last question for you. So you think with the Bering Straits, there needs to be now a Bering Straits vessel traffic control center?
I don't
I
think
know it's
there.
a pretty broad, sweeping question, but based on
I think that
volume, or do you think you have the capacity where you are and some tweaks need to be added to it?
the traditional vessel traffic center or vessel traffic monitoring centers, whatever that around the country, Houston, Los Angeles, San Francisco, what have you, much more engaged, talking to mariners back and forth, have radar coverage, and are for much more active ports. In LA Long Beach, you have 100,000 transits a year versus maybe 1,000 here. But the fortunate thing is that technology moves so quickly over the last several years that some of the things I talked about as far as keeping aircraft from hitting ships in Kodiak, or sending automatic emails to the Park Service when a cruise ship exceeds a speed limit for a well-protected area, which never happens now because it's like having a ticket issued the moment you do it at a light, traffic light or something like that. This technology of having alerts and alarms go off, and then the AIS can send a message back immediately. This program, say you're outside the traffic lane, request advice, something along those nature, would have a dramatic
Impact.
positive impact on ensuring maritime traffic comports with whatever standards of care or traffic schemes or ATVAs and other measures or risk reduction measures, environmental protection measures, all those. We have a higher level of compliance and through technology and never could beforehand.
Let me say, and for all of you on this panel, I have to say each one of you gave recommendations, which I've done a lot of different hearings. Sometimes you get the testimony, but it never leaves, and then they say good luck. One, I want to thank you all because you did give some very specific recommendations on technology to how to change some of the ways we operate. Helen, some of your ideas, and Eleanor on some of yours, and Helen being online, I think was important because hearing this aspect of what we're talking about on a local level was important for us to deliver back to DC. So I thank you all for your recommendations. And Jack, let me say that, again, I want to echo, thank you for putting your organization together. It is helpful on many levels. From a policymaker, I can tell you from NGOs, from agencies to private sector, to know there's a place and a point you can go to that attempts to represent. I don't want to say always, because I know how that goes. It's like telling the fishing community everyone speaks with one voice. That doesn't happen. As the chair of this committee, knowing that at Fisheries, but I want to thank you for doing that, and we look forward to your progression in that, and anything we can do to assist, we'd be happy to do that. Thank you all very much, and I appreciate the time, and we are adjourned.